Looks like Andre's here. Araya's here. Anybody else so far? Welcome to class. Thanks for coming here on a Thursday afternoon. It is so beautiful. You should probably be outside playing, but I'm going to thank you for being willing to come to class today. Okay. So just remember this week we are covering 2 chapters instead of just 1 chapter. Somebody texted me today and wanted to know if that represented the chapters getting easier or harder, or what it represented. And it just represents the fact that we've got 22 chapters and only 15 weeks to cover. So I'm going to put together parts of chapter 9 and parts of chapter 10 and hopefully give you an appreciation of middle and late childhood this week. So that's really all this represents. Okay, does anybody have anything good to add today? Anybody have something fun happen this week so far? Anybody got good news? Talk to me, tell me something. Okay. And while I'm waiting on that, we'll go ahead and get started in our lecture. Okay, so this week we're talking about Today we're talking about socio-emotional development in middle and late childhood. Remember, middle and late childhood is that time from when you are pretty much from 5 to puberty. So it's that time from when we go into the formal educational process until around the age of puberty. We're going to talk a little bit about the emotional development and gender differences during middle and late childhood. We're going to talk about 3 things you may have heard in relation to children's self-esteem, self-efficacy, and self-regulation. Which one's better for your child? We're going to talk about how the parent-child relationship changes a little bit during this period. And we're going to talk about the different kinds of outcomes associated with blended and step families. We're going to talk about peer statuses. It does matter if you're the most popular kid in 3rd grade. Or more importantly, if you're the most despised kid in 3rd grade. So we're going to talk about peer statuses, and we're also going to talk about bullying. Were any of you bullied in school? I was bullied a little bit, but I was kind of that small firecracker kid who would fight back. So the bullies quickly found greener pastures because I was no fun to pick on. And actually, you know what? I've decided not to talk about constructivist and direct instruction this week. So even though I've got that on the PowerPoint, that's a last-minute scrap for this class. You were a bully? That's okay. You know what? We all had sort of the things that caused us to behave the way they did. Hopefully, you've grown from that experience, Eric. Do you know why you were a bully? Do you have any reasons? Wow, that's so interesting from an educational standpoint. Let's go ahead and talk about it if you want. While I'm chatting up the lecture, while Eric's writing his response, I'm going to go ahead and start the lecture. Talk a little bit about gender differences. You know what? Females are slightly larger and heavier at this age, representing the fact that they've gone into, and I've mixed a couple of these things. What I found is some gender differences in chapter 9 and gender differences in chapter 10. So these gender differences may not necessarily relate to socio-emotional. What I did was I took all the gender differences I could find from chapter 9 and put them together with chapter 10. So here's where we're going to talk about that. Gender differences. Females are slightly larger and heavier at this age because probably they're going into their puberty changes right now. So the little girls are going to be bigger than the little boys right now. Male brains are a little bit larger than female brains, not significantly so. What you're going to find, though, is that the female brains tend to have more folds, and it's the folds that create the surface area of gray matter, which is where the thinking and the intellectual consciousness comes from. So females, although their brains are a little bit smaller, they have more gray matter surface areas. The parietal lobe, which is right back here in front of your occipital lobe, and behind your frontal lobe is a little bit, there's areas in your parietal lobe related to visuospatial skills that are larger in males than there are in females. So the little boys are going to have a little bit better visuospatial skills than the females at this age. However, the amygdala, insula, and the frontal lobes, which are responsible for emotional processing, are more active in females. So your females are going to have a little better emotional functioning at this age. And, you know, if you think about it, these are kind of differences that we see across the lifespan. One of the things I notice is that when you look at the difference between female and male golfers, it doesn't seem to be so much in the distance they drive. It just seems like the guys make longer putts than maybe the females, representing sort of these visuospatial skills. And on the other hand, females, as a general rule, are going to be better at expressing and perceiving nonverbal emotional cues, expressing emotions, and just in general better emotional functioning. So Eric says he doesn't know why he was a bully. He just wanted people to pay attention to you. You know, it turns out that bullying does give you some sort of degree of status in middle school. Excuse me. Sorry, hope everybody was wearing a mask there. But you know, there is a certain amount of status in middle school that's associated with being a bully. Now, the long-term effects of being a bully aren't great. Hopefully, you've worked yourself out of those. But in middle school, sometimes it does help you be popular as a boy if you find another boy to pick on. Okay? So, cognitive skills, tests of, you know, always want to see who performs better in school, who's got better intellectual functioning. And what you're going to find is that standardized tests and tests of school performance and school achievement are going to show some general differences between boys and girls. Girls tend to have better verbal skills. They do better in reading class and writing class. There doesn't really appear to be any difference in math skills, but any of the sort of the classes that involve engineering or moving objects around in your mind, the boys tend to do a little bit better in those classes. Now, when you look at overall achievement, graduating from high school, going to college, getting scholarships, being in gifted classes, what you're going to find is that your females are better at most of these educational outcomes. However, there are behavioral and emotional factors that play into this improved achievement, not just raw computing power. It sounds like I'm trying to argue against females because I'm a male. Y'all aren't smarter than us. Girls do seem to have better reading, writing skills, but that's not the only reason that they do better in school. They have better emotional control and, better self-regulation skills. So all of these feed into the fact that your females are going to do better in educational settings than our males. However, your book suggests to you that when you look at these differences, note that they are not clear differences that differentiate boys from girls. Look at the chart right below me, and what you're going to see is that the boys are better at visuospatial skills. But what do you notice about these two graphs? They are very close to being on top of one another. So you may see just a little bit of difference one way or the other, but this is sort of how these differences are represented. They're overall average differences, but there are tons of boys that are good readers, and there are tons of girls that are really good at engineering in the visuospatial skills. So don't make too much of these cognitive development differences. The one thing that does sort of, I think is impactful that we probably ought to pay attention to are the reasons why females in general tend to have better achievement overall in educational settings. And you know what? I even noticed that here in the community college, you're going to notice that your females, as a general rule, tend to make better grades or tend to fail less often than do the boys. You still get the same number of A's between males and females, but what you're going to get is a few more failures from the boys. And when you look at overall college acceptance, you're going to see that it's skewing in the direction of females as opposed to males. So there are better educational outcomes for the females. Now, what you're going to notice in terms of personality development, you're going to notice that boys tend to be physically more aggressive. Your girls are going to be verbally more aggressive. All right, so your little boy is liable to physically bully you or push you around or beat another boy up. But the females know how to use relational aggression, not including you in the party, talking badly about you, more relational type aggressive behavior. Now, as I suggested to you, females have the increased activity in their emotional centers, so they're going to be able to show, they're going to do better when it comes to emotional functioning. They're going to recognize nonverbal emotions better. They're going to show more sympathy, empathy. They're going to be able to self-regulate a little bit better, and they're actually going to demonstrate more pro-social behavior than your little boys. So these are kind of the differences between males and females. Yeah, exactly, Aria. They're basically the same. And you're right, it's just people looking for thinking that you can boil differences down to one another. Now, yesterday we were talking about differences in IQ testing. This is the same thing that you're going to see in your differences among minority groups. There are going to be average differences, but the curves are so similar that really they don't represent anything. There's so much overlap that it really doesn't matter. It's when these differences become magnified and become stereotypes that I think they become real problems. Very good observation, Araya. Very good. Now, the evolving self. Remember I suggested to you that kids don't have really, we say they don't have a self-concept or self-awareness before the age of 2. We then suggested in early childhood, children are going to talk about themselves in solo terms, not in comparative terms. They're going to talk about their concrete abilities, and they're going to be extremely positive. So remember, I have red shoes and I can run really fast. That's how your 3-year-old's going to describe themselves. Now, as children move into the middle age, their self-description is going to become a little more realistic and adult-like, if you will. So they're going to describe themselves in terms of psychological traits and characteristics. I'm aggressive, I'm shy, I'm friendly, I'm likable. So they're going to start talking about themselves in terms of personality traits, and they're also going to talk about their social characteristics, that is, the groups to which they belong. So your 3- and 4-year-old's not going to talk about being in a family or being on a ball team. Actually, they're probably not going to be on a ball team, but they're not going to talk about themselves in terms of their group characteristics. Kids in middle childhood will start to talk about being a Boy Scout or a baseball player or sort of these groups that they belong to. And kids, for the first time, because they're at school and they're finally starting to compare themselves with others, kids are going to start using comparative terms to describe themselves. So the kid from 3 to 5 is describing themselves in a vacuum. They're not comparing to anybody at all. But your kid in middle and late adulthood is going to become using comparisons. Still, as a general rule, these self-descriptions are going to be mostly positive. And although depression does occur at this age, this is still a little young as a general rule for depression to start setting in. Now, when you look at the onset times of psychological disorders psych difficulties, they do come at characteristic times. And still, I think depression's still a little young for this age, although there are certainly cases of depression being diagnosed at 7 and 8 and 9, but it's still a little bit early for that. Now, remember we also talked about theory of mind, and I suggested to you that the 18-month-old kid isn't going to understand that other people can have different preferences. What I like, I'm going to assume you like. We then suggested during early childhood, the child can understand people have different preferences, but they sometimes don't fully understand that people can have incorrect perceptions. Remember the box of crayons, the box of pencils study, and there were crayons in it. And at this age, if you showed the 3-year-old that there are crayons in the pencil box and then ask them what somebody else is going to think's in the box, they're going to say crayons because they aren't going to have this fully developed theory of mind. You know what? That's going to really start to mature during this age. Kids are going to be able to take other people's perspectives in a more complex way. So you can say, well, what did they, your eighth grade your teacher in second grade may ask you to imagine what the Indians felt like, or what the settlers felt like, or what cowboys might have felt like, and they might ask you to sort of begin to take the perspective of other people, and you're really going to be quite good at it at this age. And not only are you going to be good at really adopting other people's perspective and developing a sense of empathy, but you know what? You're now going to realize that not only can sometimes people be wrong, but sometimes people have an agenda, and you're going to be skeptical of other people's claims. And you're now going to know that some people, not only are they wrong, but they might be trying to trick you too. Now, not everybody develops perspective taking at the same rate. Remember, development is unique for each and every kid, and some people don't develop these skills as well as others. And what they're going to suggest to you in your textbook is that there are going to be some kids who aren't as good at taking perspective as other kids, and these are the ones that are going to have more difficulty in middle school, or in elementary school and middle school, because in order to when you get into the machine, that is public school, you have to learn how to cooperate with other people. And if you don't have this ability to take perspective, it's going to be a challenge for you. Now, Erik Erikson argued that this time was the fourth stage of personality development. He argued now you move away from the family and you move into the public sphere around friends and teachers, and for the first time you move outside the family. And he says we are now learning the difference between something well done and something done poorly. So no matter what your 2-year-old picture draws, you're going to say it's the most beautiful picture ever. No matter what kind of tower your 4-year-old builds, you're going to say it's the most beautiful kind of tower that you've ever seen, because it's your child. When your child goes to kindergarten or first grade, they're going to learn that sometimes you write the A correctly and sometimes you write the A incorrectly. So at this point, children are learning to develop a sense of industry, a sense that they can do things that are good, learning how to do something good. And so children become invested in learning how things work and making them work and doing things well. And your kid's going to want to try out plans and make things. And you have to give them encouragement, even though they're not great at things, so that they build a sense of industry while not going overboard and letting them think that they do everything well. And so what you're trying to do is build a sense of industry, but at the same time, you want to put them into situations where they can also struggle a little bit. Because not only do you have to learn how to do something well, but an important skill is learning how to deal with the fact that you do something poorly. One of the things that I find with a lot of students is that you have difficulty stinking at something. You know what I mean? We have this world where everybody's told that you have to be perfect, you have to be perfect, you have to be perfect. And students, when they don't do something perfectly, they get quite emotionally upset about it. And I would say this is because we haven't taught our children that it's okay to suck at something. You know what I mean? It's good to learn how to do good things, but you also have to learn how to be willing to deal with not being good at something long enough to learn how to become good at something, right? Now, if you sort of give your kid a chance to succeed and fail, and you kind of support them so they succeed more often than they fail, but they still learn how to do things that they're not great at, they will develop the virtue of competence, right? So we want kids to have a sense of trust. That's the first virtue, right? That first year of life. Then we want them to have a little bit of willpower, right? That's the second stage. Then we want them, which is the ego strength, to have a little bit of confidence, if you will. Then we want them to have initiative, which is that early childhood thing, which is just the gumption to start doing something. And then we want them now to have the competence, which is the ability to learn how to do something well. So do you see how you're sort of building this strong foundation of self-qualities, according to Erik Erikson? Yes, Eric Fleming, we do have to learn how to fail. It is an important thing. You know what? There are some people, he argued that some people, parents find something that they're good at and then just push the kid to only do that, only good do that, only do that. And these kids develop what he called it the maladaptation of narrow virtuosity. They basically learn how to do something good, and that's all they do in their whole life. And they lead a really restricted life because they're afraid to stretch outside of that one thing that they know they're absolutely good at. So it's important for you to learn how to be good at something, but it's most important for you to learn how to challenge yourself when you are not good at something. Blah, 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 right? Okay, self-esteem, self-concept. How important is self-esteem? Back in the 1970s, when I was a kid, it was all about self-esteem, and they were trying to make us feel good about ourselves. Results be damned. You are a valuable human being, and your self-worth does not depend upon how well you do school, how fast you run. Basically, you have to learn to accept yourself as a good person. Your self-esteem is your global evaluation of the self. Sometimes people refer to it as your self-worth or your self-image. Really, it's just basically your general overall feeling about yourself. Now, there's a very famous questionnaire called the Rosenberg Self-Esteem Questionnaire. It's a 10-item questionnaire that is supposedly a very accurate evaluator of your level of self-esteem, which is just your positive affect to yourself. Now, self-esteem is part of, but not all of, your self-concept. So in a sense, your self-concept is your beliefs about you. So I know that I'm an athlete and I play baseball. I know that I'm a teacher and I'm good at that. I know that I'm a pretty good father. So in a sense, my self-concept is all the beliefs about myself, and whether they're positive or negative, they help me develop a level of positivity towards myself we'll call self-esteem. Now, when I was growing up, self-esteem was the most important thing. And in fact, they suggested that really that's all we should focus on, and it would be a panacea for our kids. They'd have great lives. The question is, does your parents loving and caring for you and creating this positive self-esteem, does it really, really help you? And it turns out that self-esteem is not as helpful as you would think. In fact, really, it's not so much about having good self-esteem, but avoiding having poor self-esteem, right? In fact, sometimes if your self-esteem is a little bit too high, you do not have any accountability. I'm not sure if that's what you were referring to, D, but sometimes your self-esteem can be a little too high. So children with high self-esteem, you know what? They don't necessarily do better in school, but you know what? They are more willing to try things because they think they can. They have this inflated sense of self, which leads them to do things. And you know what? Sometimes you just have to have the gumption, as my grandpa would say. You just gotta have the nerve to try something. And you know what? These kids with high self-esteem, they will try because they truly believe they can do it. Now, the weird thing is, it turns out that bullies often have a really high self-esteem. That may not be true for you, Eric. You said you actually did it because you kind of felt bad about yourself and you were trying to fit in. But it turns out that you'll see that sometimes bullies and actually people who go on to abuse their relationship partners tend to have really high self-esteem. Kind of bizarre, isn't it? Now, here's the deal though. You definitely don't want a child that feels badly about themselves to the degree that they have a negative evaluation of themselves. Your book's going to talk about all the negative things that are associated with children who have low sense of self-esteem. They have problems with weight. They have problems with anxiety, depression, more likely to attempt suicide, more likely not to go to school because school makes them feel bad about themselves. And you know what? The weird thing is there are some kids who have bad situations, which maybe you could say, you know what? I understand why that kid feels badly about themselves. But the bizarre thing is sometimes kids whose situations shouldn't lead to self-esteem do lead to self-esteem problems because they have a distorted sense of self. So your self is just an idea that you have inside your head. And the crazy thing is you can be a kid who's got it all and still have no sense of self-esteem. It's not really tied to our abilities per se. And too much self-esteem really is by definition, will lead to narcissism, this lack of empathy and this excessive self-focus. Very good point, Lorena. Oh. Right, let's see. Oh, you're talking about industry versus inferiority. I'm sorry, I'm going to refer back to a comment. D. Mills was talking about the fact that, if you do kind of help your child learn how to do something well and do things poorly and learn the difference between, it sort of gives them a sense of accountability. I would agree with that. I hope that's what you were talking about, D. I hope I'm wrong. Right, I might be wrong. I want to try skydiving. You know, I almost went skydiving once, D, but we got rained out and I never developed the courage to go back and try it again. Okay. Now, what's more important really than self-esteem? Let's talk about self-efficacy and self-regulation. Self-esteem is this overall global general view, attitude you have towards yourself. Is it positive or negative? But a fellow named Albert Bandura, way back in the 1960s, thought that there was this other concept that was a little more important. He called it self-efficacy, which is your belief that you can engage in a course of behavior to achieve an outcome. Your belief that you can do something, right? And he argued that this was a learned orientation. He actually started out as a behaviorist, so he started studying behavioral concepts, and he realized that the learner develops, not only is the learner conditioned by reinforcers or punishers, but the learner begins to develop an idea about whether or not they are able to achieve the reinforcer. And this becomes a personality style, if you will. And he identified this as self-efficacy. And he argues that self-efficacy is a context-dependent skill that develops as a result of 4 situations. Now, what do I mean by context-dependent? Well, each of you probably has a feeling of what we would call relationship efficacy, your ability to find and maintain a close relationship. Some of you would say, you know what, there's no way. I always seem to have trouble with relationships. There's no way I could find anybody that would want me, right? And then others of you think, man, I can find somebody. Of course, I'm good at relationships, right? And then we have school efficacy. Some of you are convinced that you can pass any class you take. And some of you are convinced that you can fail every class you take, right? So we have sports efficacy, we have relationship efficacy, we have school efficacy. These are sort of learned orientations that we have. And what Bandura would argue is that you want to develop a child with feelings of self-efficacy in these different and important areas of your their life. How do you do this? Well, just like Eric Erickson would say, there have to be some mastery experiences. You have to put your kid in situations where they can succeed, because nothing builds confidence like doing something correctly, right? The second thing is vicarious experiences. Nothing builds a person's confidence about being able to do something like seeing somebody else do it. I know you folks are too old for these music references, but Jimi Hendrix, I think, is a freaking horrible singer, but he is a very famous rock and roll singer. And he said he was afraid to sing until he listened to Bob Dylan, who is possibly even a worse singer. And when he heard Bob Dylan sing, he said, wow, I can sing. I knew if Bob Dylan could sing, I could sing. And so, in a sense, seeing somebody else do something, watch. If you want your kids to do what the other kids are doing, like jump in the pool, have them watch the other kids jump in the pool. And they'll see that the other kids can do it, and so they'll develop the confidence that they can do it. Verbal persuasion. This is telling your kid that you can do it. But you know what's more important than positive verbal persuasion? Negative verbal persuasion. You can spend all of your time trying to build up your kids' efficacy at the pool or the ballpark. But if you tell them that they suck, that they can't do something, that they are bad at it, you can steal their self-efficacy. So really think about verbal persuasion. You can persuade your kid that they're good, but just be careful not to tear your child down. I remember one time I was watching my 10-year-old son play baseball. I think he was 11, and my 9-year-old son was sitting beside me. I was in the stands, and my 11-year-old kid did something that was stupid. And I remember just saying, God, he sucks. And my 9-year-old kid looked up at me and said, do you say that about me when I'm when I'm on the ball field? And I felt absolutely horrible. And that's the moment I stepped out of my kid's sporting experience as a coach or a participant, because I realized that I was doing more damage than I possibly could. Right? So you can steal your kid's efficacy. And then you know what? The weird thing is we actually interpret our own body's response as clues to whether or not we can do something or not do something. So if you do things, if you're trying to do something and you're uptight and your kid cries, they're going to interpret that emotional state, the crying and the negative emotional state, as proof that they can't do it. So you don't want to push your kid into doing something to the degree that they throw a tantrum, because they then interpret that negative emotion as further proof that they can't do something, right? Now, self-efficacy, it's going to lead to better outcomes in school as well, but the research doesn't really directly support self-efficacy as much as it really looks at, as much as it supports the idea of self-regulation, right? So you want your kid to feel confident. You want your kid to have a global sense of positivity about themselves. But really what's most important is you want them to be able to manage their behaviors, their emotions, and thoughts, because this is how it all starts. And so if you remember, we talked about emotional control last week, and I was talking about emotional coaching versus emotional dismissing, parenting styles. Really, what you want to do is talk to your child and help them learn to identify their emotions, understand the causes of those emotions, and then redirect those emotions. Really, it's all about the self-regulation of the behavior. If you remember the marshmallow study too, being able to control your impulses, it turns out that self-regulation is really going to be important in a lot of more important qualities of the areas of the child's life. And your book talks about the factors associated with better self-regulation. You know what? Your kid's going to do better on achievement test scores in school. They're not going to act out as much. And you know what? It turns out that there are negative factors associated with being poor, but good self-regulation might actually work as a protective factor in these cases where poverty is persistent. Self-regulation, it's discipline, but not so much just behavioral discipline, but emotional discipline as well, Eric. Okay? And I don't mean discipline as in somebody from the outside is always beating you, but learning how to do it yourself. So it's all about learning how to regulate your own behavior, your feelings, and your thought. And to a certain extent, we are in control of those. I mentioned it, I think, earlier in this week, and I'll mention again. How many of you work with someone that cannot control their emotions? Does anybody have somebody who has a bad attitude at work and constantly loses their temper? Would you want to work with that person? More importantly, would you want to work for that person? Right? How many of you had that friend in school that couldn't stop partying long enough to study for the exam? How many of you were the person in school that couldn't stop your partying long enough to study for the exam? How many of you can't put the video games down to study for an exam or to go to work? These are all, let's call it self-discipline or self-regulation is probably a good way to think about it, Eric. Okay. Again, here's the deal, kids. Again, we're trying to develop a kid's emotional understanding so that they can regulate these emotions. And there are a lot of things that you can do as the parent to move this on. But let's talk about the difference between just sort of the prototypical differences between early childhood and middle childhood. So your children are going to have improved mental understanding. That is, you're going to be able to go back and they're going to be able to talk about emotions that they've had before or think about emotions that they might have in the future. So they're going to be able to talk about emotions more as from an abstract point of view during this age. And your book refers to that as emotional mental time travel. So you can begin to talk to your kids about emotional experiences that they've had and emotional experiences that they're going to have. Whereas in the early childhood age, you're talking to the child about the emotion that they're having right now. If you understand, right? And you know what? They can also understand that more than one emotion can be experienced in a particular situation. Has anything ever happened to you that makes you simultaneously happy and sad? You know, I got this big promotion at work, but that means I'm going to have to change working groups, so I'm going to lose some of the people that I really like to work around. Right? We all understand that we have sort of these competing emotions at times. Exactly, Eric, right? This ability begins to show itself in the middle childhood years. And kids are going to begin to understand what kinds of events lead up to emotional reactions, which is going to allow them to avoid making other people mad or sad. You know what I mean? Your kid's going to understand, hey, we shouldn't tell so-and-so about this because that'll make them mad. Or we're going to have to tell this to Aunt Judy and it's going to make her sad. So they're going to begin to understand how events lead to emotional reactions. Again, this sort of relates to the emotional time travel. And you know what? Kids are going to be good at developing a poker face right now. 3-year-olds do not have poker faces. 8-year-olds can have poker faces. And kids are really good at managing their own emotions. If you've done your homework, they now know how to redirect those feelings and control their negative emotions. And kids are really going to start to genuinely demonstrate empathy, maybe not so much in a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old, but 6, 7, and 8-year-olds. So in a sense, your kid's emotional hardware is going to start to mature at this time. Now, your book does talk about socio-emotional education problems. One of the things we know, and I mentioned this earlier this week, and I talked about it in webinar, Kids fail in school for lots of reasons not related to intellectual ability. And one of the reasons that kids fail in school is because they have socio-emotional problems. So there are intervention projects which have been developed that are designed to help children develop better emotional regulation. I'm not going to spend any time talking about these, but I'm just going to point them out to you. The CASTLE program, second step programs are two approaches to helping children develop socio-emotional abilities. If you remember, we talked about oh my goodness, what was that problem, that intervention for the kids from 4 to 6 years old? I was talking about it earlier this week. Oh my God, that intervention problem. Crap. Head Start. Yes, thank you. So I think second step is sort of a follow-up to the Head Start program, which teaches emotional regulation, making friends, communication strategies, and it's specialized for developmental ages. And so the weird thing is, not only do you have to learn how to control your emotions, but you know what? Making friends can be a hard thing to do. I don't know about y'all, but I got really good at making very superficial friends. I moved around an awful lot during my elementary school years. I actually went to 3 different schools in second grade: Asheville, North Carolina, Spartanburg, South Carolina, and I wound up in Chicago, Illinois. And so one of the hardest things for me growing up was making friends, man. You're always the new kid. You know, that finding a place to sit in the lunchroom the first day was always the toughest part, right? You don't want to go for too high a status group and get shot down and get embarrassed in front of the lunchroom. But at the same time, you don't want to pick too low a status a group and mark yourself as somebody to be picked on. So choosing that place to sit in the lunchroom the first day was always a big challenge. No, Eric, my preacher's kid, moving like every year. No, I like to kid people and tell them my daddy was a bank robber. But no, he wasn't. He was actually an engineer, a draftsman. And so he would go along from that power plant to power plant or military base, helping them draw the plans for whatever they were building. And he drew electrical wiring systems. And so we would always be at some new power plant or some new military base. He even worked up in Alaska for a while on the Alaskan pipeline. So we moved around quite a bit. Okay, now check it out. During this age, your kid is finally getting out from underneath you. You have to learn how to let them go a little bit. You're coaching them in early childhood. Now what you're doing is you're collaborating with them as middle childhood. So you're not going to control their moment-to-moment activities. Now you're going to encourage them to do certain things. You're going to set up certain environments for them. But really, your kid's going to have the ability to choose things on their own. So you're going to have to let them take over and develop some autonomy, if you will. I promise you, you do not want an 18-year-old kid that doesn't know what to do. You have to start building that autonomy early. Some parents think that you don't give your kids autonomy till they graduate high school. If you do that, you will have a kid that doesn't know what to do with autonomy or freedom. So you have to start doing that 5, 6, 7. You know, yeah, you can schedule play dates for your kids, but you have to give them chances to pick their own playmates too. You have to give them time to play in unsupervised groups. I know a lot of parents want to watch their kids do everything and micromanage every interaction. Bad. You got to let your kids go now, right? And so you're going to have to start allowing them to do that. And you know what? Now is the time when you really need to quit spanking. They're smart, they can understand emotions, they have empathy, they have all the tools. Really, you're going to start using less physical forms of punishment, and you're going to start trying to explain things and reason with children, and you're going to start using more of these sort of these other types of reinforcers or punishers. So no play date, no fun activity, the video games get taken away. We're not going to be doing the spanking as much as we're going to be doing other forms of behavioral control. Okay. Eric, I wonder if you were a bully because you were a preacher's kid and you had that preacher's kid syndrome where you had to appear to be tough. Do you think that might have played anything into it? So you're a manager as much as you are, and not so much a coach. Now, if you give your kid this autonomy, but while providing a structured family environment, you're going to have a child that's going to be able to do well in school. They're going to have less school problems, and they're going to make better grades. It's all about giving your child the chance to develop some self-discipline on their own. Oh, not your dad. Okay. All right. So, and you know what they find is that attachment still is important, but it's a wider thing now. It's how attached you feel towards the family, how much you feel accepted and loved by your family. Not just your primary caregiver, but now you've got your brothers and your sisters, mom and dad. You've got this entire gestalt of family. And children who do not have a secure attachment to the family are going to be more likely to internalize their problems and not talk about them. They're going to start demonstrating anxiety and depression towards the end of this stage. But kids that feel accepted and loved and a part of their family are going to have an easier time learning how to regulate and recognize their emotions. Step families. Blended families. You know, divorce has become more common in the United States, and that has led to the dissolution of the typical nuclear family with a mom and a dad who stay married and have the kids. There's lots of different types of step family structures. Your book talks about one where you have a stepfather and the mom has kids, or you have the stepmother and the father has the kids, or what most of us probably experience, the blended or complex family with both of the parents have children. So you've got step brothers and real brothers, step sisters and real sisters. I come from a very complex family. My dad got married when he was 17 and my mom got married when she was 17. They got married to completely different people. My mom had 4 children and my dad had 5 children, and both of them got divorced in their late 20s, met each other and married me. Married and had me. And so I grew up in a nuclear typical family with mom and a dad here, but I always had these step brothers and step sisters kind of floating in and out of my life. And I've got 9 half brothers and sisters. So sort of the blended aspect there. Now, in step families are not always bad. The outcomes are not always as good as the typical family without the divorce, but they're not bad. Children typically do report better relationship with their real parent than with their step parent. Okay, and even though this is the case, 3/4 of adolescents are still going to say that they get along pretty good with their step parent. Did any of you, how many of you got along well with your step parents? How many of you did not get along well with your step parents? I'd be curious. And but what you're going to find is that the good relationship with the step parent, when the step parent and the custodial parent are in lockstep, you're going to have less adjustment problems. But there are some small adjustment problems that kids will have when they're trying to deal with the step family situation. And it's going to be different. The outcomes aren't quite as good as they would be for the child in the non-divorced family. We got closer. I got along fine. We were not that close. You know, maybe that's the best you can hope for, Araya, is that there's no war. You know what I mean? You didn't pick that parent. And so it's got to be weird, and I'm sure there's all kind of dynamics going on. So maybe not having problems is the best you can hope for. So in middle school, we're going to start having these bigger peer groups. We're not going to be around our parents as much. The boys are going to start to go with the boys and the girls are going to start to go with the girls. Actually, that's happened in early childhood, but it's definitely going to be these subdivided groups here in early and middle childhood. You're going to see the boys hanging around in maybe larger groups, and you're going to see the females maybe in groups of 2 or 3, smaller groups like this. So we're now going to start having that sort of, if you will, that peer group outside of the house. And everybody knows as soon as you get out into the real world, status starts to matter and we start to have problems. Now, it turns out that they have this cool method called the sociometric method where you can sort of figure out how kids are accepted in their classrooms. So you go into a given classroom and you ask all the kids, hey, which of these kids do you like and which of these kids don't you like? And what scientists found is that there appear to be 5 sort of categories of children. There are the kids that everybody seems to like. They're the popular children. Then there are some of the kids that receive an average number of likes and dislikes. They're called the average children. You know what? There are some kids that everybody just kind of ignores. They don't dislike them. They just never pick them as somebody they would like. We'll call those the neglected children. Some children are picked by everybody in the class as somebody that they don't like, right? And then you're going to get those kids that are going to get a high number of positives and a high number of negatives, those controversial kids. Which kind of kid were you in school? Were you a popular child? Were you the average child? Did nobody pay attention to you, or did everybody dislike you, or were you one of those controversial Axl Rose kind of kids? What were you? I would say I was just the average kid, I would imagine. I would imagine I was the average kid. I wasn't super popular. People did talk to me. I certainly wasn't neglected or rejected, but I don't really see myself as being controversial or super popular. Right, I imagine most of us were average. Now, it turns out that these peer statuses, the ones that really is the worst is the kids that are rejected. Now, a lot of times these kids are rejected because they have the poor emotional regulation abilities, right? So just like we talked about, learning how to regulate your emotions is important in early childhood for school acceptance. If the kid has some behavioral problems, they're really immature, or they don't have the emotional skills that the other kids, they're going to be rejected. And being rejected is a risk factor for rule breaking and aggressive behavior. If you don't feel like the other kids like you, you're going to act out. Now, there are a myriad of reasons why people turn into adults who become violent, and it's a cascade of experiences. But one of the things you'll notice is that sort of being rejected early in life is a big risk factor for some of these bad outcomes that we sometimes see on the news. Okay, and briefly, I want to talk about bullying. I am so sorry, folks, for spending all of your time, but we're trying to get 2 chapters in this week. Bullying. Boys are most likely to be bullies. Who's going to be bullied? Most likely boys and younger middle school students. So it seems to be the boys bullying each other. And people who have certain personality traits. If you're anxious, awkward, or kind of withdrawn, you sort of invite the bullying. It's not fair, but it's the sort of the characteristics that cause you to get bullied in school. Nobody bullies the popular kid or the good athlete. It's that shy, withdrawn kid that becomes the easy target for the male bullies. What are the outcomes of bullying? Man, it can make you feel bad about yourself. You know what? If you're bullied in middle school, there's higher incidence of depression, thinking about suicide, and even attempting suicide. So bullying is really, really a bad thing, and it has these terrible impacts, especially as kids move into adolescence. You know what? Even if you make it through adolescence and you grow up, we still carry the scars of the bullying. So as adults, you might be anxious or depressed. You might even have agoraphobia, which is a fear of big public spaces. And you may, people who are bullied are more likely to use mental health services as adults. Now, it's cool to be a bully in school, but in general, these behavioral patterns, this lack of empathy and this aggressiveness is not going to work for you as an adult. But the weird thing is, it seems to work for some boys boys, it seems to bolster their self-esteem and their social status. So I'm not sure. Maybe boys do that because they can't build their status by using good emotional functioning. I'm not sure. And then your book has a mention about cyberbullying. I grew up in the 70s. The boys used to pick on us before school and after school. But now you can be picked on 24 hours a day in your cell phone and everywhere, which only ups the impact of bullying behaviors. Okay, that's all I had to say this week. I am so sorry for taking so much time. Again, we were covering 2 chapters this week. That was a lot of details, and I still left a lot of stuff out. Does anybody have any questions? Neglected. Okay, so Eric, now it's all coming into focus. You were a preacher's kid. You felt a little neglected. Maybe for you, yeah, I can certainly see how maybe you acted out a little bit to get attention, even though you're a really nice guy. Makes perfect sense. So we talked about socio-emotional development in middle and late childhood, and we gave Eric a therapeutic intervention today. Any questions? If anybody has any questions, feel free to type them in the chat bar. I'll stay on the chat bar for just a second. If you have any questions later, go ahead and send me a remind text. I'd love to hear from you, and we can talk further if you're interested. If anybody has any, if you don't have any questions, I'm going to go ahead and log off right now. But I look forward to seeing you next week in lecture. Don't forget to do your discussion board. It's due tomorrow night. That's all I have to say. Have a great day and be safe this weekend, okay?